Hi, this is Eric. Before we begin today, I want to speak a little bit about the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, starting on August 8th at 1 a.m. GMT, or Friday, August 7th at 6 p.m. Pacific Time, with the keynote speech by Dr. Scott Wright, K0MD, a great friend of the podcast and well known to amateur circles worldwide. I'm starting this early to allow U.S. hams to then be able to hear the speakers from Australia who will be presenting in their local time, 17 hours ahead of California. The rest of the expo will open at 8 a.m. Pacific Time on Saturday for U.S. hams. You see, our QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is not a Zoom conference. It is built on a platform used by Fortune 500 companies and major universities. It costs as much as renting a convention center for the 2 days, but unlike a physical on-the-ground convention, the entire project is available for another 30 days on demand. The costs for this project are paid for by selling exhibitor booths. I need your help. If you haven't signed up yet for your free ticket, please do so. This will reinforce the confidence of our platinum sponsor, ICOM, and our gold sponsors, Flex Radio, Elecraft, DX Engineering, RT Systems, RFinder, and Gigaparts, that they made the right decision to support this groundbreaking effort. Use the Tell a Friend button on the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo website to send a ready-made message to your friends urging them to sign up. They will not be signed up automatically, as I'm not saving the information that you put in. They have to push the button themselves. Remember to double opt-in by clicking on the confirmation message after signing in order to be eligible for the amazing prizes donated by our sponsors. Tell your favorite ham radio equipment suppliers about this project. Emanuela, my exhibitor coordinator, is calling ham radio vendors. We will make a demonstration of the platform to any prospective exhibitor to our expo. Our gold sponsors agree that if we work together, we can get 50,000 hams to this conference. A conference of this size would be a first in amateur radio history, and a virtual conference of this size would be a trendsetter, recognizing that even after the pandemic is history, that virtual conferences will still be here to allow hams worldwide to share their projects and views. You can be a part of this history-making event by promoting it to your friends and ham radio vendors. Thanks for listening. QSO Today, Episode 306, Julius Jones, W2IHY. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705, all-band portable transceiver. More on this later. And by QRP Labs, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver and a whole host of parts and kits for the ham radio builder. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. Julius Jones, W2IHY, had an early interest in electronics and radio as a teenager growing up in Boston, Massachusetts in the early 60s. Like many young hams in those days, the intoxication from the space race and the evolving technology led young Julius into a career in engineering and the establishment of his own company based around solutions that he needed for his own ham shack. W2IHY is my guest in this QSO Today. W2IHY, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Julius?
4Z1UG, this is W2IHY, Hyde Park, New York.
Julius, thanks so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
It started when I was about 13 years old, and my mother and father bought my brother and myself, I have a twin brother, a crystal radio set, right? And I remember winding the coil and basically getting it to work. I lived in Boston, Mass at the time. And I heard WBZ 1030 with a pair of crystal headphones on, and that's how I got interested in radio. And a friend of mine who lived across the street, he went to Boston Latin. It was in high school, and I went to Boston English. Boston Latin had a ham radio club. So he basically got interested in ham radio and got a novice license. And I was somewhat intrigued when he would talk about it, and that's what got me interested. I got interested because I guess I was competing against him in some ways, but he got me interested in ham radio, so I ended up getting a license, and I sort of connected up with a old timer. He was a World War I, I believe, radio operator. His call was W2IHY, Homer Ringwood, right? And he gave me my novice test. I'll never forget going to Homer's house. He had a rack with a transmitter in it, and sitting on the table was an NC303. Well, my eyes got big when I saw that receiver. I mean, looked like a piece of beauty to me, right? It would go, 80 through 10, and he had converters for 6 and 2 on it, and I just couldn't believe it, right?
Had lots of knobs.
Had lots of knobs. At that time, I was 16 years old when I got a novice, and not very knowledgeable relative to radio gear. So again, my eyes bugged out when I looked at him. He was unbelievable. He could basically copy 40, 50 words a minute CW and talk to you at the same time, right? Which blew me away. I just couldn't believe it, right? And he claimed he could copy radio teletype. Well, I don't know if that's true, but that's what he claimed. He could also copy radio teletypes. He was an old-time operator.
Well, I think you could. Don't you think you could, in your head, copy Baudot, right? I think you had 2 tones with radio teletype. So if you were trained, I would think that you probably could copy Baudot.
Well, he claimed he could do it. He claimed he could copy radio teletype. And what was interesting about Homer is he worked with me after I got my first station. I bought an Arc 5 surplus transmitter, and he worked with me to build a power supply for it and getting it to work. But my first amateur radio equipment was an Amico, I think it was an AC1T, 15 watt, 40 meter, 80 meter crystal controlled transmitter, and a Fillmore CR5AC receiver, which was a 4-band receiver. So I would use it primarily on 80 and 40. It was pretty deaf on 10. But the thing I remember is I'd turn on 10 meters, right? And the only thing I could hear is I could hear a guy on AM. His call was W2IHY. He sounded incredible, right? A year or so later, I was walking from my house to the train station in Boston, and I would go by there all the time, and I would see what appeared to be a clothesline in the back. What I found out was that was W2IHY's cubicle quad, right? And he invited me in once. I forget his name. He invited me in, and I go and I look at his station. He had a room with his transmitter. He was an engineer. He had built the transmission equipment, which used mercury vapor tubes. So you open the door, and you got these glowing purple tubes, right? So he was running full legal power on AM, and he had his receiver was, I'm trying to think of what the receiver was. It was a HRO 60, right? Now, an HRO 60, when it was put out, was almost like a piece of test equipment. It was an incredible receiver. So he had the HRO 60. He basically had his 1 kilowatt station on 10 meters running with a cubicle quad. And I saw him a couple of other times in the neighborhood, but, that station always blew me away relative to, what he was running. So those were my first encounters with ham radio.
What year was that you got your first novice license at age 16?
I got my novice license in 62. That's when I got it, right? I got the general in 63, right? And at that point in time, generals had all privileges of ham radio. And then they went into incentive licensing, and they took away those privileges. And at some point, I was interested in slow scan TV, so I got an advance so I could operate that. I didn't get an extra until 1999. I think I got an extra just before they changed the rules where you didn't have to copy 20 words a minute. So I got I passed the 20-word a minute test, passed the theory, and the rest is history.
The reason perhaps that slow scan television required an advanced class license is because slow scan was operating in the advanced portion of the bands in those days?
That's correct.
Right. It wasn't that generals couldn't do it. It's just that they didn't operate up in the general portion of the band.
That's correct. So I sort of pushed to get an extra if I wanted to operate on slow scan TV. So just went in or took the test and operated SSTV for a while.
So did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
It really made a tremendous difference, me being a ham radio operator. When I was younger, I would pick up the amateur radio handbook and be in awe at some of the articles. I said, someday I want to be able to understand what these guys are saying in these articles. And when it came time to make a decision on what I wanted to take after high school, I said I want to be an electrical engineer. I had an uncle that worked at Lincoln Lab as a technician. He told me what being an engineer was like. And he also told me what the curriculum in college would be like, which I liked science and math, which was really to my advantage. I decided I'd go to be an electrical engineer. So that's what I ended up doing. But what's interesting about the handbook, again, I looked at the handbook in awe. And one of the things that I always wanted to be able to do is to write an article for the handbook and know enough to have an article in there. And in 1989, I had designed a digital voice recorder, and the league put the printed circuit board for that recorder on the cover of the handbook. And so for 4 years, 89, 90, 91, and 92, that my digital recorder was published in the handbook. So that was one of the, I'll say, a dream that actually became reality.
Now, did you write any more articles for the handbook after that?
No, I approached them for another article, a follow-on, but at that point in time, they weren't interested. So I really never wrote any other articles for the handbook. But the digital recorder, in a way, is what got me into doing audio. What I did for a living is I worked for a little over 30 years for IBM. I actually was a computer designer. I designed digital computers here in Poughkeepsie, mainframes and supercomputers. And so I would design things for my ham shack because I was a middle manager, but I was a frustrated engineer, right? So I really liked basically building things. So as an offspin of the recorder that I had designed in 89, there was a chip out that did digital recording on it. So I took the chip, I put, let's say, combinational logic around it to make the thing usable from a user perspective, but I put an audio equalizer in it, a dual band EQ. So the guys in the club, I brought it to the club for the show and tell time, and a couple of guys basically said, "Hey, can I take that home and see how it works?" I was interested in digital recording. They were more enamored with the EQ, right? They liked playing with the equalizer. And that's how everything got started. They said, you should sell this thing, but they talked about the EQ, right? And so, I sort of blew them off initially, but I ended up at some point in time coming up with a dual band EQ that I actually sold at the same time I was working for IBM. Again, frustrated engineer.
And a budding entrepreneur at the same time. Now, you're up in the Northeast Corridor, and you were in computer design about the same time that I think that, who was it that wrote the book, The Soul of New Machine, which was about the development of the Data General?
It was Data General, yep.
Were you kind of in those circles up there at that time?
I definitely understood I read the book, and I could relate to what they were saying from a design perspective. I didn't work, again, Poughkeepsie is about 3 hours from 2.5, 3 hours from where Data General was, right? So I wasn't in those circles, but I clearly understood or could relate to the story. Right? And I actually write some stories myself for some of the experiences that I had, believe me.
But you were kind of for IBM, I think in those days, they were selling System 34s, or this is even before that was the 370s and The big mainframes?
Yeah, when I joined, it was System 360. The first machine I was part of the design for was the 3168, a 370 or 360 machine. I worked on the interface between the cache and the memory, right, is what I ended up designing. Then after that, I worked on caches as an engineer, designing the caches. And then when I became a manager, I was really managing CPU designs, right? Was what I was managing. And then ultimately, supercomputers, I ended up managing the hardware development in Poughkeepsie for supercomputers, which was really interesting. We usually had 2 or 3 projects going on at the same time, and spent a lot of time on airplanes going to Livermore Labs in Austin, Texas, etc. So that was the latter part of my career was a fun time, right? Fun time in my career with IBM.
So then at a certain point, you kind of chucked it all, and you started a new company that led to the founding of W2IHY Technologies, right?
Yeah, what actually happened was when the organization I was managing was made up of hardware and software, but I was managing the hardware part and there were programmers on the other end. And I was about 53 at the time, horrendous amount of stress. It's a $1 billion business. And at some point I just said, I've had enough of this, right? I believe that if I stay doing what I'm doing, this guy's going to take years off my life. So I went in one day and I said, Mike, in 6 months, I'm out of here. And so I retired. I had been doing the dual band DQ. My customers gave me feedback. They wanted more function. So I had just come out with something called an 8-band DQ at the time. And when I retired, and the thing went ballistic, right, relative to sales and et cetera. I myself don't build anything. I did when I was some of the stuff when I was myself, but that was problematic because I just couldn't keep up with it. So I have other subcontractors that do the building for me, and I, for the most part, answer the phone and customer interactions. So if you look at EHAM and some of the feedback, you'll find out that I'm customer centric. That came from the values that I picked up from IBM, where if a customer had a problem at IBM, they would fill the ear with people to resolve the problem. They would do whatever it took to resolve the problem the customer had. So I've sort of adopted those values relative to how I deal with the people that I sell equipment to.
And now this message from ICOM America. Get out and be active with ICOM's new IC705 and its optional multifunction backpack. The ICOM IC705 is your perfect QRP companion, as it has many of the same base station features and functionality of ICOM's bigger rigs. At the tip of your fingers, in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at 1 kilo, or just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. The ICOM IC705 has a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall, similar to the IC7300. I can't wait to get my IC705 to use as a baseband rig for satellites and microwave projects, including the S-HALE geosynchronous satellite. The ICOM IC705 puts out 5 watts with its BP272 battery pack and a full 10 watts when connected to an external 13.8-volt power supply. The rig does single sideband, CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Other features include micro USB connector, Bluetooth and wireless LAN over Wi-Fi, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, a micro SD card slot, and the HM243 speaker microphone is standard equipment. As this is the perfect QRP or QRPP rig, the perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional LC192 backpack with its special compartment for the IC705 and room for accessories for soda activations or just a day social distancing in the park. For more information on this fabulous new rig, click on the banner in this week's show notes. And when you go to buy your new ICOM IC705, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsorship of the QSO Today podcast. I was looking through your website of what you have on W2IHY technologies, and it looks like the whole audio problem is a problem that you're solving. I think that there's a lot of people, especially with the new rigs, that think that you can buy any kind of microphone and you can hook it up to a 7300, or in your case, you actually started with earlier rigs. But what's wrong with that approach? How would you select a microphone as a starting instrument in working single sideband, and what characteristics would you look for in order to make it work with your rig?
Normally, if I'm selecting a mic myself, right, I try to get a mic that has reasonably good articulation on the high end, but basically can reproduce the lows on the low end that are in my voice, right? There's a number of mics out there that, some of them are inexpensive, some are moderately priced, whatever, right? I've used some of the Heils, which the 40s and the 781s, etc., right? At least for me, work well. But for my voice, the 40 needs EQing, especially on the low end, to get rid of some of the lows. But works extremely well, right? But there's also some higher priced microphones that work well also, but they're higher priced. So what I tried to do with my product set was to solve the problem where somebody could take a microphone that they likely had, put my product in, right, and be able to adjust their audio to get the response on the other end that basically brought out what they wanted to hear. So the EQ, in effect, is basically compensating for the microphone. It's compensating to some degree for the person's voice. And it's to some degree compensating for what the radio is doing. And so you're trying to find a happy median in all that, right? But the other thing you're trying to do is you're trying to solve a problem for getting rid of some of the potential extraneous noise in the background that people may have. Pretty classic that someone's running an amplifier, has fans running, and when the person stops talking, it's pretty clear he's running an amp, or he has an air conditioner running in the background. So I put things like noise gates in, or downward expanders, etc. But I've always found the key is if you have a product, I always believe you want a product that's targeted for a particular problem, and not develop a product that is looking for a problem to solve. So the products that I have basically evolved because of problems that I thought clearly were there. Even I have something called an iBox, right? A friend of mine who's now deceased, he called me up. He had rack gear sitting there. He was having RFI issues. He couldn't get the levels adjusted properly. So he said, "Gee, can you throw something together to interface between my rack gear and the radio?" So I built something. I sent it to him, and he said, "This works great." So he said, "Can I put it on my website?" And I said, "Yeah, no problem." So he put it on his website. I started getting emails. "Can you build one of these? Can you build one of these?" Right? And it got to a point I would hand build them, no printed circuit board, and it became a pain, right? So I said, I got to come up with a general solution, right? And so I came up with a general solution where the output was adjustable, filters on the input and the output, and the iBox was born, right? And it was born in trying to solve a problem that somebody had, and to make it a general solution that basically a lot of different people, can use. So again, a problem, a solution offered. And if you look at the products that I make in general, what I always have in mind is a set of products that work as a system, right? So my EQs, I have EQs, I have audio switches that can connect together, and I even have a coax switch where you can take my audio equipment connected through the audio switch to the coax switch. So you're turning one knob and everything is switching. You're switching audio to the radio, you're switching the coax to the radio, and if you have multiple amps, you're the same time you're selecting which amplifier is being connected to the radio selected. So again, what you're trying to do is provide a system solution. But I think today, the other thing that's important is to try to make things easy to use. I look at a lot of the ham gear today and I just shake my head. I go, this stuff is too complicated to run for most guys. You know, you look at the menus, and what happens is the menus themselves abstract the radio from the user, right? I, as an engineer, some of the stuff in there, I have no freaking clue what it's doing or how it's doing, right? You know, what's happening with the radio. So I'm a believer that what you really want to do is make things easy to use as you can. So I look at my competition being some of the rack gear that's out there. Stuff works great, but I consider it substitute products from the perspective of their main target audience was not ham radio operators. It's really for small bands, low-cost studios, etc. So it works great in that environment, and can also work great in ham radio environments, assuming you interface it properly. But can hams deal with all the knobs and all the variety of function that they have? Most cannot, have difficult times spending inordinate amounts of time to get it working. So again, my target at least was try to make it as easy to use as I could.
Well, I think that one of the problems that some of us old-timers have, I guess I consider myself an old-timer now, almost 50 years, we've got too many rigs. You know, we've got the new rig, and we've got a rig that we've had maybe for 15, 20 years, and we have the rig that we had maybe when we were kids. So for me, I have a TS520, I have a Elecraft K2, I have an IC7300, and they're all sitting there, and I like them all, and I'm afraid I'm never going to get rid of them. If I go before my wife, she's going to have to schlep it out to the trash or call the ham club to come get it. So the question is, I want one microphone to use with it. I want maybe a keyboard or a set of speakers. And it would be great to have a box that I could select each one of those rigs and that the impedances and the microphone characteristics and the matching for each rig will work with my microphone. Do you have a box that does something like that?
Funny you mention it. No, my boxes do exactly that. A single microphone can be used with a variety of radios, from old bone anchors, the old Collinses, all the way to a FTDX 101 or the Flex 6600 or the Anon 8000 or whatever radio. So you could have a bone anchor on one output, you could have a Flex on another output, and whatever radio you want on a third output, and you're just switching between radios using a single microphone, one mic.
Right, and that box will switch everything, and if I buy the coaxial switch that goes on the back of that, then I can also switch the radios between antennas and...
Yes, turning one knob. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to make operating the station environment easier. So instead of having a bunch of manual switches that you have to be extremely careful on how you set up to switch these different radios in, because you might damage something. At least my systems try to basically make it easier for the operator and take that worry out. At the same time, if you're using the coax switch, it has good enough isolation that you could actually have the three radios on the same frequency and switch between the three. You could say, hello, this is Julius, click, W2IHY, click, in Hyde Park, New York, and you just talked on three radios, and the S meters on the ones you're not selecting is on like 10/9 or something like that. So, the problem of isolation has also been solved.
When you said earlier that you built a dual-band audio equalizer with your digital recorder, what makes an audio equalizer dual-band?
It has bandpass filters in there, and the center frequencies there are such that they look like two individual bands if you sweep them, and you can play with the gain. So if you look at my EQs, the center frequency is fixed, the width of the filter is fixed, and what the person is adjusting is the gain, right? They're adjusting the actual gain or the amplitude. So you have a bass and a treble, you just have to carefully determine what the roll up and roll downs of the filters are, right? And so when I do the dual band design of the current products, those are the only parts of the design I actually simulated on a computer, because I wanted very precise roll up and roll downs. And then I just validated that in the prototype they did what sweeping it that I wanted to do, right? So I wanted a valley in the middle, meaning what I found is that with the 8-band, if I basically start boosting, let's say 400 to 1200, somewhere in that range, the audio sounded muddy. So the shapes of the filters is that you get a roll down at around 500-600 hertz with the bass, and you get a roll up of the treble at around 1200-1000 hertz. In the middle is a valley, right? And it's to where if you were to boost that, the audio would tend to get muddy. So you get clarity with the treble, you get warmness with the bass, right? And that was the intent. And it seems to be working pretty well, at least for the dual band.
Julius, is there a scientific way of adjusting equalization for a ham radio operator in the single sideband mode? I'm setting up my rig on 40-meter single sideband. I've got a brand new microphone, regardless of the vendor. I've got your dual band audio equalizer. Do I need test equipment, or do I just call a friend across town who says, listen to me and tell me when I sound beautiful? Or is there some scientific way of setting up this equalizer that doesn't require a lot of on-air time with a friend across town trying to figure out whether I got it right?
If for either the 8-band or the dual band EQ, I usually tell people to put their mic on, plug their headphones in the monitor of the EQ itself, right, and listen to what you sound like, right? Now, what you're putting out into the monitor, right, the radio is going to sort of potentially modify as a function of what the audio circuits in the radio are doing, right? So the next thing you could do is actually listen to the monitor of the radio, which may be a pretty true representation of what's being transmitted or may not, but use that as a reference point. The third thing would be if they have an external receiver, a second receiver, listen there. But the thing that I usually recommend with people is that they get somebody that knows that they know, and do two things. Have them listen to them on the air, right, as they're transmitting, but talk on the phone at the same time so they have a reference point of what it is that they sound like. Then have them change things. So if they're not trying to color their audio to sound differently, they should be able to adjust their audio so that they sound like they would if they were there. And I usually, I've done that hundreds of times with customers where I'll talk to them on the phone, listen to them on the radio, and over the phone tell them what to change. And it's been pretty successful, right, relative to getting their audio set so that it's reasonably close. And I usually say those are preliminary initial settings, and then they could basically tweak it a little bit over time if they want. But I also say I also tell them if they're on the air and they ask somebody or a group of people, 5 folks, how do I sound? You probably will get 10 opinions. So sometimes you basically have to stop diddling with the knobs, right? And so I know my own self, there was a station who I knew, and my final tweaking was talking to him and got myself dialed in. With my products, especially with the 8-band, I do give preliminary settings for people with mic radio combinations that they can use as I call initial starting point, right? So it gets them in the ballpark so they can fine-tune what they sound like afterwards.
Hey, this is Eric for just another short break. One of my favorite ham radio podcasts is the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, hosted by George, KJ6VU, my guest in episode 232, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ. George and Jeremy take a bi-weekly deep dive into their favorite ham radio workbench projects and the technologies that fascinate them. If you want to be a ham radio builder or just be inspired, click on the link in this week's show notes page.
Now, in a product that you're using to switch between multiple rigs, Does that mean that you have multiple 8-band equalizers in each of those audio paths in order to create a characteristic that's unique to the rig?
I'd like to sell them individual ones for each radio. However, usually what I tell people is it can be slight differences, especially with modern rigs, between the radios. So what I myself have done is I'll pick a radio like the Flex. That'll be a starting point. And what I've done, I have a Pro 3 as one of the radios. I will go into the menus of the Pro 3, and I tweak the EQ a little bit so that it sounds like the Flex, given the same bandwidth, right? And I've gone in the menus of my Flex 1000 and done the same thing. So if I switch between the three radios, someone listening, they'll say they sound all alike. But I use the 5000 as the reference point, and then tweak the other ones just a little bit so that they all sound similar, right?
Everybody that runs single sideband, at least on the older rigs, and I see it on my new rigs too, has an ALC setting, automatic level control. What do people get wrong most of the time with the ALC? That if they were paying attention, they could get it right and sound beautiful?
I always perceive that people have a tendency of liking meter deflection. Let's deflect this all the way to the right. And I usually tell people, I've done experiments with a number of radios on the air with people. And what I found myself is that I always set the drive level to the transmitter to get the minimal ALC movement for the power output that I'm trying to get. So if I'm trying to drive, let's say, my amplifier to 50 with 50 watts or get 50 watts output, a lot of times you're at 50 watts and the meter's all the way, is going 3/4 of the way or farther. I will then turn the gain down, the drive down to the radio, the audio drive down, to a point where the power just starts to drop off. And that's where I will set it. And if you look at the ALC deflection, a lot of times it'll go down, right? It'll actually start going down, 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 down. And for a number of the radios, I've found that even when you're at the high end of what they would consider acceptable ALC movement, that you can hear distortion in the audio, and the audio is cleaner when the ALC movement is lower. So you're getting the same power output. The ALC movement is lower, but the audio is cleaner. So I don't know if that's scientific, but that's usually what I recommend.
And do people follow that instructions, or do you still hear people on the air that haven't gotten it right?
The people who I've talked to, they follow those instructions, right? On the air, there's a number of people that don't run my stuff. It's hard for me to generalize for the general population. But listening to folks, I think with some of the new equipment out there that measures distortion, there's stuff out there to help folks adjust the drive to their transmitter correctly, right? I'm trying to think of the guy. He makes a box. Talent Post, I think, is a company. He makes a box, an LP 500, 700. Those are tremendous pieces of equipment. Tremendous engineering went into those. I do not have one myself, but I have a number of customers that do have one. I've looked at it and probably going to buy one. That piece of equipment can help you set up your radio drive, et cetera, look at the linearity of your transmitter, et cetera. Again, it's designed to be somewhat simplistic to use, but works great. Larry did a tremendous job in designing that piece of equipment. I don't know if you're familiar with it at all.
I'm not, but I'm going to look it up. I love test equipment. A question comes to mind. With the proliferation of software-defined radios and our ability to remotely control them, do you see that it would be possible to create a network of on-the-air software-defined radios that act as community test equipment for setting up radios properly and taking, say, distortion measurements and that kind of stuff? Do you see that that's possible? Does somebody like you have to come up with an entrepreneurial idea to create a subscription test equipment on the air system? What do you think about that, Julius?
So what you're saying is...
I log into it from a website. It's listening somewhere in my area. I want to do some on-the-air tests, so I find a clear frequency. Because this thing is wideband and it's software-defined, I set my rig interface onto the frequency that I happen to be transmitting on, and then after I transmit, I get a whole report back on what I need to do to make myself sound great.
Yeah, it's possible. What you're saying is somebody does something where they're transmitting a signal, and there's a reference that's something going into their microphone so that on the other end they're actually measuring the distortion.
Yeah, I'm saying, for example, that there's a receiver somewhere in the area that has maybe software that's running that does distortion analyzer and spectrum analysis, so you're looking for suppressed carriers and all that stuff, and you just log into it and you use it as a piece of test equipment that you don't own, but it's kind of owned maybe by a radio club or a community or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's possible to do something, have a network where you're connecting to it, you're transmitting, there's analysis done of your signal to tell you what the distortion is, linearity, etc.
Right.
I believe it's possible.
So one of us has to do it. We're almost there, right? I guess I can go to WebSDR and I can listen to signals all around the world. The next thing is to have a bunch of meters and switches that tell me what's actually happening.
Yeah, the key thing is going to be do people perceive it's a solution to a problem that is real or requires attention. There's the key.
Right, that's true. We don't want the donkey pushing the cart in this particular case. What's your rig? What's in your shack these days? What kind of radios?
If you go to my website, you'll see pops up as my station. Sitting on the table right now, I have an FL 7000 amplifier, a Palstar AT Auto tuner, a Flex 1000, a Flex 5000, and an ICOM 756 Pro 3. Sitting in a box for the last 4 years is a Flex 6500 because I have to actually tear my station apart to get it out, right? And I have a partial rack that I'm going to put on the left-hand side to do it. And I just, every time I looking at doing it, I say, I'd rather make a few contacts and have to tear this place apart, right? So those are the radios that I have. The radio I operate the most of the time is the Flex 5000, and I run the Pro 3 on occasion also, which I like that radio. I will never get rid of it.
I believe the ICOM 756 Pro 3 was a very popular radio. It's my understanding that it also was an early radio that could be remote controlled.
I'm not sure if it could be remote controlled other than with some of the software that's out now, external software. I've never run remote at all, but I like it. I like it a lot.
Well, if it can't be remote controlled, I'll get an email from a listener this week that'll tell me what it can or can't be done.
It might be. I'm not a remote operator, so I'm not sure.
What kind of antennas do you have on the QTH?
Right now I'm down to 2. I have a Mosley Pro 67 C3 at 60 feet. And then I have a full wave 80 meter loop, right? Horizontal with a reflector under it, right? And I sort of built the reflector as an experiment to get rid of the tune section that I had. I had like a quarter wave or something like that of 75 ohms followed by 50 ohms. And I thought about it. I said, okay, I looked at quad designs and I said, let me experiment and put a reflector underneath. In theory, the impedance should change. So about 0.12 wavelengths below the driven element, I have the reflector, and it's a closed loop, right? And it's about 5% longer than the driven element. And sure enough, the impedance came down. It's like 1.1 to 1 at 3.8 megahertz. Works like gangbusters.
And does it make it more broadband? I mean, usually with an 80-meter, 75-meter antenna, you've got to somehow tune it in the middle of the band. Does that antenna become naturally kind of broadbanded on 80 meters?
Not really. On the far ends of the band, like if I go to operate CW, I use the tuner. I forget I have bandwidth curves, but not in front of me for that antenna. But it's pretty good. I can run without the tuner for 300-400 kilohertz. It's pretty good.
What does the reflector, besides changing the impedance of the antenna, the reflector under the antenna, does that make it better for NVIS? Does it change the radiation pattern of the antenna?
It changes the pattern, believe it, so that it's more what you call a cloud warmer.
It's an NVIS antenna almost like.
Yeah. But what I found kind of strange with this antenna, and I never really tried to do experiments on why, is it works pretty well out to even the West Coast on 80 meters. I've worked California, which surprised me. I usually get very, very good reports if I'm 200-300 miles in. Initially, I'd run barefoot, and people would say, "You're running barefoot?" It worked that well, right? They thought I was running an amplifier. But that particular antenna seems to work reasonably well even farther out. It stinks on 40 because I've tried it on 40. I've used it in other bands, but because I have the Pro 3, there's no need to run it on 40 through 10 because I have a big antenna that I can turn. I used to have a 160 Carolina Windham up, but the tree that I was supporting it from the center died. And I was, I don't know, maybe 40, 50 feet from the house, and this tree was tall on a hill. So I said I had to take it down. I was concerned about if the tree fell, it would hit the house. So I lost the 160 and I haven't put it back up. That worked well on 160, but like I said, I'm down to two antennas: the 80-meter loop in the Pro 3, which has been up about 20 years.
What's your favorite operating mode?
Right now, it's primarily sideband is what I go on. I used to be a CW operator when I was younger, primarily. In the last 20 years, I've probably had 10 or 15 CW contacts. So primarily sideband is where I can be found. At some point, when I get a little bit more time, I may diddle around with digital modes. The other mode that I'm somewhat interested in is satellites, right? Trying to basically work through a satellite. Yep.
And do you have rigs for working through satellites or converters, transverters?
No, but ICOM has one that I'm going to probably buy. Their new VHF radio. I'm probably going to. It's not that terribly expensive, and it's companies that make antennas that I can even put in the attic if I had to and work the satellite.
Right. Do you actually need to use attic antennas, or are you just doing it as a way to keep them nice and clean and shiny?
Keep them shiny. I mean, there's one customer told me about what he does, and he has them in the attic, and with a amplifier for receive. And I was like amazed. You can work the satellites, no problem. So I think I may try that route to try to do some satellite work.
So he might be using like an egg beater or a halo.
Yeah, he's using antennas from M Squared. It's what he's using, right? And I believe one of them is an egg beater like antenna. So
it's pretty cool. And the wife won't get upset if it's in the attic, right? She can't see it.
She can't see it. She gets sometimes she gets annoyed with the reflector on the loop. Because you can see it in the air.
And the dog gets snagged up in it, right?
But in general, she's been pretty supportive of my ham radio career.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. Does your twin brother, did he ever have an interest in ham radio, or did he go in a different direction? I asked the question because I have an identical twin as well, who shows no interest forever in radio.
He had a license for a short period of time, and he let it lapse. He really hasn't any interest. We both ended up working at IBM. It's a long story. He ended up he started somewhere else, and I ended up convincing him to come work in the digital domains, right? So he retired, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years ago, way after I did. So, and he lives in the general area. He lives maybe 20-minute ride from me. You have a twin brother. Interesting.
I have an identical twin, yes. If you're wandering around Bucks County, Pennsylvania, I have an identical twin who's about 40 pounds heavier, but we still kind of look like each other, and we sound identical.
Yep.
I beg the forgiveness of the listeners as we're talking about our twin brothers, but when I was first married, my brother would call my wife on the phone and pretending that he was me. That is trouble in the making.
Yep.
So what have you been doing during the COVID-19 pandemic? Has it changed your ham radio operating and the way that you're conducting your life?
Once a week I have a sked with a guy that he and I used to work together, right? I worked for IBM, so we have a sked. My business went nuts for about 2 to 3 months. I mean, hymns were home. They said, no, let me get re-involved in this. And, the orders went absolutely nuts because, again, folks had time at home and they wanted to get reintroduced to the hobby that they were participating in at one time, or decided, let me buy one of these boxes and try it out. I've heard them on the air. Also, I've been involved in some community service activities, delivering food to people, usually from leave at 4:30, get back at around 7:30. And my wife and I have been involved with that. Usually it's non-contact, we'll drop it off, etc. That's really more of a continuation of some of the stuff I was been doing before COVID-19, because I'm involved in a lot of stuff with the community.
Now, you mentioned to me that you're a prison chaplain. Is that what I understood?
No, I'm not a chaplain. I've been involved in a prison ministry called Kairos for 20 years. So what happens is you have a group of people who are involved in different denominations and Christians. So it's non-ecumenical. And we'll go into a prison and put on a 3-day retreat, and then we'll go back once a month for encouragement. So I've been involved with Kairos for a long time. What's very interesting is the Kairos I'm involved in now is at a maximum security prison. The way they run it is a lot different, right? When we do the reunions once a month, you don't have to have done a weekend. So the first time I went there to a reunion, I'll never forget, there was somebody who was sitting by himself with one other guy, and I said to somebody, what's going on? How come nobody's sitting with him? And it turns out this particular guy was a Jewish brother, and he would come to listen to what was going on. So I said, next time I'm going to sit down with him, right? Now, you and I talked about this. So I'm sitting down. I sit down with him. He says, hi, I introduce myself. I give him my first name, not the last name, right? So then I said to him, so do they have Talmud classes here? You should have seen his face. What is this about? And so we talked over the last couple of years, right? I actually look forward. He and I basically sit together and have long conversations about a lot of different things. But the reason I'm involved in Kairos is because we who go in the prison basically we go in somewhat non-judgmentally, right? But what we're trying to do is give the prisoners, people there, encouragement. But the other thing is we're really trying to give them hope, right? I think in life, whether we're on the outside or on the inside, having hope, right, it becomes extremely important in your life, right? And so we all make choices in what we do, right, over time. The ramifications vary from person to person. I myself, I feel blessed with the things that have happened to me in my life and the things that God has done for me. But I also feel called, right? to be doing some things that I've been doing.
What do you think the greatest challenge is to amateur radio now?
I think the greatest challenge is getting young people involved, right? Because when you go to Hamfest, you see a lot of people with gray hair like myself there. And you do see some young folks, but I think keeping the number of people involved in ham radio and licensed up so that the bands are active, so that in the U.S., and so that there isn't a draw for the FCC to take away some of the frequencies, right? They're not, that there'll be pushback because there's a lot of folks who are using them. So just viability relative to the numbers that are there. Obviously, young folks have a lot that are actually pulling on them. They can use Zoom like we're using, right, and to communicate. They can. They have cell phones. They have. They can do a FaceTime if somebody has an iPhone or whatever. So there's a lot of things that are competing with ham radio. There are sports activities, etc. But if you can get them interested in electronics, and they can basically see something that they're interested in relative to their future, just as I did 60 years ago or 1962 when I got started, right? It spurred an interest that got me interested in computers, and computers primarily got me to where I'm designing audio gear, right? And so it was really ham radio spurred at least the direction I would take in my life, had a lot to do with it.
It would be interesting to figure out how to make the same kind of feeling that we had when we first saw the lights and dials and switches and meters. Like, this is it. We're controlling all of this. Maybe that's a man thing. I think that was what impressed me as a kid as well. So how do you create that same kind of feeling when you have a generation of kids who've grown up with this technology in their hands from the very beginning, and now all this stuff doesn't have any knobs, switches, meters, or lights, right? It's all a flat screen.
But you really do have knobs and switches. They're just part of what you're visualizing on the screen, right? I mean, look at my Flex. It has a lot of controls that I could diddle with, right? The other thing is, if you look at the evolution of ham radio, it's kind of interesting. Back way before I was a ham, the hams primarily made components, right? They'd make their own components. It evolved to where hams basically purchased components or took components to build equipment. So you get the heat kits and other things. You look at QST, they had construction articles, and you'd build things, right? So what it's basically, the change that has occurred at this point is that ham radio operators have become systems integrators. They're buying and integrating them together, right? And for the young folks who basically have spent hundreds and hundreds of hours playing with their computers, some of those systems are in software, right? They're basically taking software programs and interconnecting them to do function, right? So I think if presented properly, right, some of the things that really spurs their interest relative to computers, there's a connection between what they're doing now and ham radio currently and in the future.
Yeah, I hope so. I can't say that I have the prescription. I ask this question a lot. I don't have an answer yet. I see that, at least over here, kids are oversubscribed. They're doing too much all the time. They barely have time to sleep. What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
What advice would I give them, besides buying my equipment?
Certainly, there's been a bunch of those that have come up over COVID-19, but what advice would you give to newer returning hams?
I was kidding about buying my equipment.
No, you shouldn't be kidding.
In a way I am. I probably would tell them to take the time, experiment with different modes of operation if you can, right? So if you were on single sideband before, go on single sideband, become familiar with it again, talk to folks, but understand what other options you have. And then if you can, right, just experiment and play with that. Some of them you aren't going to like, right? You're going to do something else. Others, other things you may like. There's still things that you can do building. You can build antennas, for instance, right? It doesn't require a PhD to build your antennas. So there's still things you can do from a building perspective and experimentation perspective. So that's what I would tell them. But whatever you do, you want to have fun doing it. Because if you're having fun doing something, those are the things you're going to come back to.
Well, I think that's absolutely great advice. Julius, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It was a real pleasure. I love learning about things actually I didn't really know before, and that's about 8-band equalizers, audio equalizers. Now I know what they do, and when I go to turn on my Behringer microphone mixer that's sitting over here, I'll actually know what those sliders are supposed to do. With that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
Okay, 73s to you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Julius. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W2IHY in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page or the banner in the show notes page that will take you to the www.qsotodayhamexpo.com website for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. I am making blog posts there as new information comes in. My thanks this week to Gigaparts, who became a gold sponsor. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support for these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages or by using QSO Today in the coupon box at the checkout. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor, monthly or annually, by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 300. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." Special thanks to Ben Bresky, who now edits the audio for this QSO Today podcast from the audio pieces that I give him. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.